right, folks, let's get going. My name is David Parsons. This is Nostalgia Trap. This is actually another entry in our Housing Trap series with Andrew Schustek, who's having great conversations with all sorts of people about the political economy of housing and urban development, things that I don't know a lot of details about, but I know intersect with a lot of the freaky stuff we talk about on Nostalgia Trap. So I hope you enjoy these conversations. I'm learning a lot from them, and this episode is one that I learned a lot from and was especially paying attention to because it intersects with my life directly and maybe yours as well. Today's conversation is with Zach Paganini. He is a Ph.D. student in the Earth and Environmental Sciences program at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Hey, I know that school. That's a great school. They're great people there. And Zach is one of them. And he's got a lot to say about the way that water is going to affect the future of housing in America's coastal cities. So him and Andrew get into talking about New York City, Florida. For me, Southern California, a place where I have just experienced a chain of atmospheric rivers. I didn't even know what an atmospheric river was, I think a month ago, but now I have learned to fear them because we got a leaky roof and all sorts of fucked up situations here. I know people have it a lot worse than we do. And so the future is that. The future is water. There have been a lot of stories from Florida and New York about this stuff too. People dying, people drowning. And that's like, the most grotesque element of it. But the larger element that we're talking about here is how this is affecting real estate and how this is affecting what rich people are going to do and what our cities look like. Zach's got a kind of vision for what the future could be. It doesn't have to be all doom and apocalypse. In fact, the people who are working in urban studies and a lot of people like Zach are thinking about ways to avoid that apocalypse. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I certainly learned a lot here. And you can find lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff at our Patreon. Check out the link in the episode description. We've been doing lots of fun stuff on the Patreon. Lots of live streams with Justin Rogers Cooper, and even bonus episodes of Housing Trap and all sorts of other stuff. So go check that out. I appreciate it. Here is Andrew Schustek and Zach Paganini.
Zach, welcome to the Nostalgia Trap. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
You come to us, another guest themed recommendation coming from Sam Stein, the three-time returning champion to the Nostalgia Trap, and who seems to be at the center of everything urban studies in New York City.
Yeah, I can't go far. I can't escape Sam's web these days. He's very influential increasingly.
He is like a father figure to some of us, and I know he'll be embarrassed by me saying this, but his book really radicalized a bunch of us at Hunter College, where I know that you taught.
Yeah, and I taught urban studies for a few years at Hunter, and I encountered so many undergraduates, like freshmen and sophomores, who had read Sam's book and were basically like excited about urban studies and about my class because of Sam. So I think not only him being able to break down housing in such a sophisticated way, but also to be able to do it in a way that's so accessible to people is something I really admire about him and hope to emulate in some ways.
Yeah, well, hopefully when Sam listens to this, his head isn't exploding due to how red his face is getting. So where did you go to school, and how did you kind of come into urban studies as a focus for your politics?
Yeah, so I had definitely a winding path to urban studies. I came into my undergraduate at Ohio State as a political science and economics, political science major, economics minor, and found all of my classes and my classmates and sort of everything I was studying very alienating, and sort of had a classic college conundrum of wow, I thought this was what I was meant to do, politics and economics, and instead none of this is interesting to me. None of this is clicking for me. And so I think I had a little bit of a wilderness period, but I started taking general education courses, and that's where I found the discipline of geography. And I found that there were a lot of Marxists in geography. I had never encountered or dealt with Marx's work before. And I just remember it being the sort of like kumbaya moment of like, oh, wow, I found my people. Here are people who, yes, are talking about politics, yes, are talking about economics, but are doing it in such a much more substantial way. I mean, just political science and economics having economics and politics being so radically disconnected, all of that never made sense. And so once I found my way into geography, which was eventually sort of a gateway into urban studies, I was able to find these fields where politics and economics were understood to be sort of inseparable from each other. And that was a much more attractive and interesting way to think about the world to me. And once I started down that path, I mean, here I am years later, I could never go away from it.
It's astonishing how many people I've met in the field and in the academy to say have said the same exact thing, and that's the exact same sort of story of my life. When I discovered geography was the sort of hub for learning what political economy was, and I came to it a little bit later in life, attending grad school mid-career. But I imagine for so many newer students now, because of the prevalence of so much of this stuff online, I hear 20-year-old kids talking about this in a way that I couldn't imagine being exposed to when I was in undergrad, and that was only a decade ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's exciting to me to see how enthusiastic the students are and how like knowledgeable they are about this stuff. I mean, to me, I always think back to transportation. I mean, there's so many things that the students are like really, really into, but I always feel like when I teach urban studies, the students come in and they just have this wealth of knowledge of like, here's what's wrong with public transportation in America. Here's why it could be improved. Here's the problem with automobile-centric cities. Like they have all of these like really, interesting ideas about the way cities should be and what's wrong with them. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that stuff is really, especially the sort of transport stuff, walkable city stuff, that stuff is like spreading like wildfire.
Right. And as we've had some conversations on the show before, it also the downside of a lot of that urbanist stuff is that urbanism isn't like real. And so you have all these like pilled people of all ages who are just using walkable cities as their lens to view the world with, instead of like where people work and what a city is, and all the materialist sort of breakdown of what a city is. Do you feel like the sort of around cities right now lends itself to easily sort of connecting those dots? Are people hostile to that in your experience, or are they taking it pretty easily to sort of turn them onto a materialist worldview?
Yeah, I think that I see a lot of the sort of like common discourse around cities is it's like, it can't, a lot of it can be sort of misleading in ways or sort of lead people down the wrong path, but it is a really useful gateway drug. Just that I have people in my class, and rather than sort of being like, hey, let me be the first person in your life to make you think about how we move through the city has a big impact on like the class structure of the city. So rather than me being the first person to ever, broach that idea to people, they've already been thinking about it somewhat, or they've been engaged with those issues. But I guess one thing I'm thinking about as like a concrete example is when we talk about gentrification, when students come into my class, especially teaching at a college in New York City, a lot of them know what gentrification is at some level, or they've heard the term and they have some familiarity with debates, especially, teaching at a working class institution like CUNY. A lot of the students, they've witnessed gentrification debates like in their own neighborhood. But then they come to class with a sort of, I would say, a bit of a misleading understanding of like the actual mechanism or mechanics behind gentrification. So they're sort of everyday understanding of gentrification is basically a Starbucks pops up in a neighborhood, a Whole Foods pops up in the neighborhood, and then everybody's rent starts going up. And that is like at some level a description of what is going on, but it's not, and it doesn't lend itself, well, it does lend itself, but it itself is not like an analysis of how this is working. So I try to really use things like that as a gateway drug and say, okay, yes, the Starbucks does show up. What if we thought about that as an effect of something else rather than as the cause of these rent hikes?
That's amazing. I was fortunate enough to give to teach a little bit at the NYU Poverty Center, and I gave a lecture on the hidden forces behind gentrification. And I literally opened with, like, when we think about gentrification, we think about the coffee shop and blah blah blah. But it ended up, what I used 421A and sort of how the EDC works, Economic Development Corporation, and how tax breaks work, and how the city's incentivized to inflate its property taxes, all those sort of like weird, complicated tax policies and subsidies, as the lens to which gentrification should be sort of.
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%.
And what drew me to your work and what I thought was freaking amazing was your work on environmental gentrification, which is a field that's growing thanks to CUNY rock star Melissa Checker over at Queens College.
Yeah, I had an opportunity to take some classes with Professor Checker. Yeah, and the field of environmental gentrification is just like exploding. Like when I first started writing about this stuff, it was like her and nobody else seemed to be on this.
She's amazing. She's amazing. We're gonna have to reach out to her and have her on. I was fortunate enough to speak to her a few times over the last few years. And before we sort of get started into your work, maybe you could define environmental gentrification, what it is, why it's different or similar to other sorts of forms of gentrification, and the weird ways that it can take place. And to be clear, we're going to discuss this in the context of New York. And so, this may look different elsewhere and function different elsewhere.
Yeah, so I would define environmental gentrification as the class remake, as in working class or middle class people are displaced in favor of a wealthier population. So the class remake of a city or neighborhood prompted by environmental factors. So there are many class remakes of areas that we can see prompted by some sort of change in infrastructure, or some sort of, long-term rhythm in the land or housing market. What I'm interested in with environmental gentrification is, what if the sort of price signals that produce the conditions for gentrification, and generally when we talk about that, we're talking about a sort of area of devaluation where a gap has opened up between the devalued level of the land and properties right now and the sort of potential rent that could be realized in an area if it was sort of rehabilitated.
And this is what Neil Smith's rent gap is describing, right?
Yes, this is Neil Smith's rent gap theory, which is basically sort of a way of understanding gentrification as occurring when a large enough gap opens up. Or really, I think the best way to think about it is when a large gap opens up between the low devalued sort of current price of property and the high potential price that it could be rehabilitated to. That's when you have the conditions for gentrification. Doesn't necessarily mean it will 100% happen, but that means that this area is fruitful. So what I'm interested in, obviously, so much work has been done on all sorts of different things that can cause a rent gap to open up, whether that be sort of tax incentives, or whether that be sort of long-term devaluation in the land market. So what I'm interested in is what happens when environmental governance or environmental factors trigger that. So this could be a hurricane sweeping through and causing a sort of shock in the property market that massively devalues everything. But this could also be something like a flood insurance program having its regulations changed so that all of a sudden everybody's housing is much more expensive. They're paying much more in insurance, and that devalues their current property. And just to sort of give you a preview of what's ahead, what I'm really interested in the case of flood insurance is cases where the high cost of flood insurance devalues current properties, but if a new property was built there up to flood resilient standards, they could actually eliminate or greatly reduce that insurance payment. So the structure of like flood insurance creating a rent gap in itself.
It's a really, really interesting set of contradictions that there's all this land being developed in New York, in the city, and on Long Island, where I focused my sort of studies on environmental gentrification in Long Beach, New York, my hometown, which is a 2-mile little island. All these contradictions around the discourse of resiliency and how expensive your life is going to be made if you want to not have your city be flooded. Could you talk a little bit about that discourse of resiliency and maybe explore this contradiction here? Like, how the hell are we supposed to like have a Green New Deal if it's just going to make everyone's lifestyle unaffordable?
Yeah, so and to be honest, I haven't even done the full sort of Foucauldian like archaeology of it would be required to figure out how it is that everybody just started talking about resiliency. But if you go back and read environmental literature from the 70s or 80s, outside of a few groups of political ecologists, nobody's talking about resiliency. But that is the buzzword, and it's one of these sort of NGO, like, not to sound conspiratorial, but these like NGOs, the World Bank, IMF, anytime they have any sort of report about anything related to the environment, everything's all about resilience. So the
resiliency, equity.
Resilience, equity, justice, these are the 3 pillars that everything is built on. And so resilience or resiliency, they also get used sort of interchangeably, is meant to express the idea of some sort of system. A neighborhood could be a system, a city, a metropolitan area could be a system, taking a shock, in this case, probably some sort of environmental stressor, a hurricane or something. How its resilience is how quickly it's able to bounce back to its pre-shock state. So when people talk about trying to build a more resilient neighborhood or a more resilient city, what they're talking about is how quickly can we get back to normal after a storm, after a disaster, after a shock. And so there's a lot of talk about sort of how do we, build resilience? How do we do this in a sort of just and equitable way? And I think the contradiction that we sort of face here is that all of our lives, all of the costs, the risks that we face, the houses that we live in and pay for, they are all structured as to be individual. And so when you talk about making a neighborhood more resilient or making a city more resilient, almost inevitably what that means is the investment or provision of new infrastructures that are going to sort of help with this resilience situation. And what that entails is an infusion of capital, right? So no free lunch. We have to pay for this somewhere, right? So if we're going to build new flood walls, new sand barriers, all these different things, that's going to require money. If you're going to improve your house to make it more resilient, to put up little flood barriers in your basement stuff, that is going to require money. All of these things increase the value of the area. They capitalize the area. They make the house more valuable. They can make the area as a whole more valuable. And so the contradiction that we face right now is there are all these discussions about how do we best pour a lot of capital into coastal areas to make them more resilient. And the issue that I think not enough people are talking about, and thankfully people are in this world of environmental gentrification scholars really bringing attention to, is you can't dump a bunch of capital into a housing market without increasing the prices. That is just not how it works. And so unless we are going to begin speaking seriously about some form of social or public housing by the coast, what talking about resilience means is raising costs on everybody and potentially creating a coastal area or sort of a US coast where increasingly only the rich and sort of really well off can live or can reside.
So well said. My experience in this sort of studying it is, so I grew up in Long Beach. It's a 2 mile little island south of Long Island. It's a barrier island, which means that it's literally on the ocean and sort of protects the rest of Long Island should a giant storm happen. And in 2012, a giant storm did happen. So superstorm, technically not a hurricane, Sandy happened, and a major sort of confluence of like the quote unquote once in a generation sort of things happened where everything lined up to sort of have this giant storm that basically created a situation where, because of the weather pattern, it stayed over Long Beach for a few more days than it necessarily like would have otherwise. And so the ocean met the bay. We're talking about like literally a few miles of a city, and everything was flooded. I mean, FEMA came. My house was completely destroyed. We lived on the floor of a family friend for a few months after that.
Wow.
And so what happened as a result was that in the cleanup, all this federal money and state money came pouring in to subsidize people to raise their homes in the name of resiliency. And what happened, and what I think is so interesting about urban studies, is to sort of get around making sure people could raise their homes in time. They changed the zoning code, of course. And that meant that in the west end of Long Beach, where the housing is really dense and next to each other, it's like a tiny little area where it's the only area of Long Beach that's zoned to allow for sort of like a central strip where there's a ton of bars. So it's like the nightlife area, but there's also like these houses right next to each other that are zoned for single family, but like one story. So they're all like bungalows and packed next to each other. There's no yards anywhere. That area got hit really hard because it's right next to the beach. It's super dense and next to each other. And so everyone got hit really hard there. That area historically is what we would call like white working class. So like a lot of white Irish Catholic folks have been living there historically in Long Beach. Whereas Black folks in Long Beach have been sort of shoved into an area called North Park by the train tracks. Originally, Long Beach was designed to be a sort of resort town for the ultra wealthy in Long Island as a vacation spot. And so like day laborers would literally walk over the bridge from Island Park and do servant work, blah, 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 and then sleep by the train tracks. I mean, literally like just pure, comically overt racial lines on how Long Beach was created. So fast forward to the zoning code being changed. They allowed the West End to basically, they got rid of the zoning laws and allowed anybody in the West End to like raise their home immediately. And this was being subsidized by the state. So the state came in and said, we'll pay half of this. But the way that the structure came out, you needed to put your money down first and the state would match it, which basically incentivized anybody with a lot of money to be able to raise their home really quickly. And so what happened was all of these people were left physically and metaphorically underwater where their homes were destroyed. A lot of people just said, fuck this, I'm out. I'm leaving Long Beach. I'm going to sell this land. You had property developers who were buying up empty lots. And because the zoning codes were changed, they were able to basically build Airbnb resorts where there was once like pretty affordable housing. And at the same time, the rest of Long Beach, the zoning code was kind of remained the same. So it took a little bit longer to like raise your house. So it created this insane rent gap where like the west end of Long Beach immediately became like a downtown, where like there was once a Chinese food place. Now there's like a literal like high-end fashion boutique. And all the sort of signifiers that we would associate with gentrification, all in the name of resiliency,
Mhm.
property. Fast forward to now, homes that were once going for like 300 to 400 grand, they're now routinely, being listed at and sometimes being sold for, 1.1 million. It's become an incredibly unaffordable place to live. My folks still live there. You know, to wrap things up here, in the North Park, they're trying to develop the Bay Area in the name of coastal resiliency, equity, etc. And they're trying to develop the historically marginalized neighborhood, um, which is just kicking people out. It's becoming unaffordable because of the West End rent gap, but also they want to now develop the North Park now that the timing is right and people are starting to look at Long Beach as a bigger destination to live.
Mhm.
Now the super blocks, quote unquote, which have been remained empty along the boardwalk for years and years and years, my whole life. They finally were able to negotiate a development with a huge amount of subsidies from the Long Island IDEA,
Mhm.
which means that there are going to be thousands of new condos, beachfront condos, which could end up making Long Beach even more affordable.
Yeah, I mean,
Unaffordable.
I think that's such a. I mean, I was taking furious notes as you were talking because that resonates so much with a lot of things that I've experienced, and I think the main thing that makes me think about is that these storms, they're really, and not just the storms, but the sort of debates around rebuilding that follow. They're really the sort of like class polarization moment. I don't know if you encountered this in your research, but I run into so many homeowners along the shores who are not super wealthy and who their status is basically next storm and we're out of here. Right? We don't, we have this place, we don't have the money to repair it if need be. I don't have the money to pay for insurance. I don't have insurance. So I'm enjoying having a place by the shore. And the next storm to come through is going to knock me out, and I'm going to sell the place at bottom of the barrel prices, and my family will stop having a place by the shore. Then at the same time, as your story illustrates, the post-storm or the recovery period, the housing recovery period, is this time of a lot of political maneuvering, of sort of launching different development projects. And it's this sort of crisis time where if you're a developer or if you're a sort of a wealthy or well-connected homeowner in an area, you can say, look, like this place is in trouble. Look, half this town is flooded. There are, the property values, the property taxes for this entire place are in danger. You'd better give me something to, help move this process along, to help get the engine going. So if you are really low income in these places, the storm or the big change to the insurance program or whatever happens in terms of the environment can be sort of a death blow that causes you to move out. But if you are perhaps upper middle class, wealthy, a developer, these moments can be a time where you finally have an opportunity to secure that big zoning change that you've been gunning for, or to secure some subsidies that you really want / need for your project. And I think that makes me think of a more general theme that I'm interested in, and that I think, us Marxists certainly are keyed into, which is the sort of crisis tendency of climate change and how crisis brings about opportunity. And I think one of the interesting things for me in my research has been really looking at how it's not just I guess one way to say it is a common framing of the big coastal property buildup in the face of climate change is that this is sort of about ignorance. Like, how can they do this? Don't they know about climate change? And what I would say, from what I'm finding, is not only do the people who are engaging in this big coastal buildup know about climate change, they embrace that climate change is really risky and that we need to actually study that and produce a lot of knowledge about how risky It is to build by the shore so that they can use that as leverage to secure new streams of funding, new types of tax relief or zoning relief. So that, I think, has been one of the most interesting things to me, is how different actors utilize the, going into this. I thought, you'd find a bunch of, you'd speak to a bunch of people like, oh, climate change, whatever, 30 years from now, no big deal. You talk to people and their stance is climate change is a really big deal. I'm helping out with a study on how much damage it could do to this area and using it to lobby for subsidies for my redevelopment project.
Oh, totally. The incentive structure is completely there. And from the perspective of cities, what's so interesting about Long Beach is it's totally embraced the resilience discourse in an effort to inflate its land values. Mm-hmm. So looking at the macro sense here, it's cities generally, and I don't want to say this about every city, but Long Beach particularly, and we could use New York City as a sort of corollary here, are incentivized to inflate their land values because it allows them to collect increased property taxes. This comes with the contradiction that if you make land too expensive, nobody's going to live there, and then everyone's going to move, and then you're going to have a crash, and then your property taxes are going to go down. But and again, this is endemic to capitalism's own sort of cycles of contradictory booms and busts. The incentive structure is there for Long Beach to say, hey, all of these Airbnbs are going up and all of these new housing and new development is going to be happening. We can reassess the property value of all of these houses. Say, hey, you thought your house was worth $600K. Actually, you're now a millionaire on paper, which means that you have a house that's worth $1 million. But that means you're going to have to pay more taxes on it because we're saying it's $1 million. Could you sell it for $1 million? Maybe, probably not, depending on the season, depending on the environment. Right now, you can't sell it because interest rates are higher because of the Fed. So you have all of these working class people who all of a sudden were told, hey, your housing is, you're now rich on paper. But that means if you don't have the income stream to pay those elevated property taxes all of a sudden, you're now out. You're going to have to sell. And guess who's going to come and buy that property? Someone with money. Mm-hmm. Means that the people who come in are going to, again, this is literal gentrification stuff. We're remaking the class nature of a space. Mm-hmm. All this is being done in the name of resiliency, and all this is incentivized by the fact that cities need to pay for stuff. Long Beach has had terrible fiscal management over the last few decades because, classic Long Island bullshit. But this has been sort of a godsend to Long Beach in many ways. Of course, they have to spend a ton of money on resiliency stuff, but the state and the feds are more likely to step in and help secure some of those funding for those projects. But in the long term, this has been great for Long Beach, despite its fiscal problem. So those contradictions are all part of studying these contradictions is sort of at the heart of our urban studies. And your work on flood insurance in Canarsie, Brooklyn is directly related to this sort of work.
Yeah. And if I could just add on to that, I mean, one of the things that, to me was always really attractive about a sort of Marxist materialist approach to urban studies is, you really keep those contradictions in focus at all times. And the point of focusing on those contradictions is that you understand that they sort of inevitably lead to crisis, right? And so the way that I like to think about property taxes in terms of this research is I talk about the property tax flood risk contradiction, which is just that you have these cities or neighborhoods that know that they need to keep their property taxes up, like you so nicely put it, right? That the name of the game is, we need to at all times be sort of keeping healthy or increasing our property tax revenues through the encouragement of healthy development in this area. And when cities look at, hey, how are we going to fund these really expensive resilience and adaptation infrastructure initiatives in the future, they are thinking about, well, do we have a secure source of revenue? And so, however, the sorts of things that would be required to really, really tamp down on sort of flood risks in an area are things that often require reducing property values and reducing property value revenues. So there is a direct contradiction between things that cities can do to increase their property taxes right now and things that cities can do to reduce their flood risks right now. And the two are in this sort of antagonistic relationship with each other. And it reminds me of when you read about sort of Florida, like retirement-ish communities along the coast, sort of like the Sarasota area, right? These like little canal neighborhoods that get cut into the coast. They're extremely, extremely risky. And at the time that these were popping up everywhere in the 50s and 60s, these Florida land managers and mayors, they knew that this was an environmental disaster in the making. But at the same time, how were they going to do anything to rein in that environmental disaster without resources, without property taxes, without revenue? So we have all these municipalities across the United States that when they talk about risks, resiliency, all these things, they sound like they're talking out of both sides of their mouths. And rather than be cynical about this, I think we as good materials scholars can understand, oh no, that's the nature of wrestling with a contradiction. They're not lying. They're not being, I mean, maybe they're being cynical, but they're also really facing a real material contradiction. But yes, so
So well said. So well said. I want to get into your work on Canarsie. It's so interesting. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about like where's Canarsie, what's going on there, and how is the sort of flood insurance market, all these contradictions like resulted in racial capitalism through the housing markets, and so forth.
Yeah, so Canarsie is a little neighborhood on a peninsula in southeast Brooklyn. Is the end of the L line. So people who have visited New York might have just seen Canarsie pop up as if they went on the L train, but not many people go there. Not many people know it. Not a tourist destination. Not a place where there's any sort of entertainment attractions. Very sort of residential and by New York City standards, almost suburban neighborhood. So this neighborhood at one point was meant to be a bit of a resort town, like many of the neighborhoods along New York City's coast. It sort of folded very early on in its life as it got overtaken by the Rockaways and other more popular destinations. Post-war, it became its population exploded as tons of post-war housing and bungalows, working class bungalows were built. And the area became sort of a hub for Italian and Jewish Americans. And so at the time, obviously, Italians and Jewish people had a very different relationship to whiteness. But if we imagine them to be white as we think of them today, Canarsie was always a pretty solidly like 90 to 95% white neighborhood. And it sort of was a sleepy suburban white neighborhood throughout much of the 20th century. And in the 80s, massive neighborhood change. Between 1980 and 2000, Canarsie goes from being 90% white to being 85% black.
What happened there to cause that neighborhood change?
So that's an interesting question. Obviously, there is talk of there having been blockbusting and of there having been sort of white flight. But another interesting thing is when I talked to people in the neighborhood, they pointed out that the point where Canarsie went through this big change, basically, if you imagine that Canarsie was a lot of people who were sort of there on like GI Bill housing, that's how they came to the neighborhood effectively. The point where Canarsie starts undergoing this huge racial turnover is basically the retirement point for that generation who would have moved in on GI Bill housing. So I did talk to a lot of the sort of straggler few Jewish folks who remained in the neighborhood, and they were sort of like, my friends didn't care that there were Black people moving in. They just wanted to retire. So we can take their word for it. But one way or another, Canarsie goes through this massive demographic transition. And at the time, people sort of predicted that, this is the end for Canarsie. It's all downhill from here, so on and so forth. Actually, the population that moved into Canarsie, heavily immigrant from the Caribbean and the West Indies. A lot of doctors, medical professionals, lawyers, and a lot of public transit workers as well. So the sort of pretty solidly middle-class Black population moves into Canarsie in the 90s through the 2000s. But what happens is that this population is targeted by subprime lenders. So Canarsie, what scholars have found is that when you have segregation is sort of like a useful way of channeling different types of loan capital. So when realtors are funneling a certain race of people all into a neighborhood, that also becomes a useful way for mortgage lenders to target that population with subprime loans. So,
and can you define a subprime loan?
Yeah, so subprime loans are basically, they are supposed to be for people who don't qualify for regular or sort of prime loan terms. And so as a condition of your credit or income not necessarily being at the level to qualify, you pay more perhaps in interest, or you might have some sort of large payment that is due at some point in the future in exchange for having a temporarily lower interest rate. A lot of these subprime loans, which really exploded in popularity in the 2000s and helped lead to the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of these subprime loans were structured in a very predatory way. So they would sort of, like I said, they would have a balloon payment structure where you're paying almost no interest for months and months and months, and then maybe 2 years into your mortgage, a huge lump sum of money is due. And so they're set up in these ways to sort of cause people to fall behind, to strip them of their housing wealth. And they disproportionately targeted non-white people. I recall seeing a study that basically a Black family that made something like $250,000 was as likely to be offered a subprime mortgage as a white family that made $60,000. So
incredible.
Race a really heavy factor in who gets offered these subprime loans. So to bring it back to Canarsie, we have this population of Black sort of middle class residents who has moved into the neighborhood, but they are essentially more financially vulnerable than they look on paper because they've been targeted by these subprime lenders. So you have a neighborhood of people who make decent money, but they are quite financially vulnerable, especially in their housing situation. Now in 2012, Canarsie gets hit very hard by Superstorm Sandy, and it ended up having the highest foreclosure rate in the entire city in the aftermath of Sandy. And this was basically because of this history of subprime lending had robbed people in Canarsie of the savings that and the equity that they might otherwise have been able to use to sort of shoulder the burden of the storm.
Amazing. And so tell us a little bit about the environmental sort of geography of Canarsie. Like why is insurance playing such a role here?
Yeah, so like I said, Canarsie is a peninsula that sort of juts into Jamaica Bay. And so it has inlets on either side, Fresh Creek and Paddergat Basin. And at the sort of bay side of Canarsie, there's actually a very large park, and there's also the Belt Highway, or the Belt Parkway, excuse me, which is one of New York's big highways. And so that highway and the large park actually work sort of to keep floodwaters from going too far into the neighborhood. But on the sides of Canarsie, development goes all the way straight to the coast. So there are houses directly next to the water. So Canarsie actually floods from its sides, not from the bay side. And that's what happened with Hurricane Sandy. The houses closest to the bay were generally okay, but it's those houses that are on either side of the neighborhood, really close to the inlets, that got swamped.
So interesting. And and as simply as possible, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how flood insurance works and how these markets are structured, because it could get a little wonky. Am I right?
Yes, it's very wonky, and I know I've gotten wonky a few times, so please just cut me off.
No, this is a wonky audience. So
okay, all right, good. If I get too in the weeds, don't hesitate to stop me. So I guess a good way to introduce the flood insurance program would be to say that back in the day, before talking about the sort of 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, when a big disaster rolled through an area, a hurricane, a flood, or whatever, it was up to Congress to pass a one-time appropriations bill before anybody would get any form of federal relief. And over time, as disasters became more regular and sort of larger in magnitude, and as I don't know, I guess congressional politics became less united around weird race issues, it became clear that there was a need for some sort of regular mechanism to fund these disaster costs. And then at the same time, a giant Mississippi River flood was so costly that it destroyed the entire private flood insurance market. So real estate capitalists, insurance capitalists went hat in hand to Capitol Hill begging Congress to set up some sort of mechanism that would make it easier for people to get money and recover after coastal floods. And so they set up the National Flood Insurance Program in 1968. So what the National Flood Insurance Program does is it produces maps of flood risk for riverside and coastal areas across the United States. And it offers flood insurance to anybody who wants to purchase it. And these flood maps that it produces have different zones that sort of categorize your risk. And if you are in the 100-year flood zone, which means every year there's a 1 in 100 chance of a flood. If you are in that zone, you are legally required to buy flood insurance as long as you have a mortgage. That's how the mandate is enforced.
It's the same way that you're legally required to buy car insurance, right?
Yes, 100%.
And under Obamacare, you're legally required to buy health insurance.
Yes, 100%. So if you get mapped into a high-risk zone, you must purchase flood insurance, and you must pay monthly premiums that are basically calculated based on elevation. So there's an elevation that they project that a flood will rise to in an area, and then they look at what's the lowest level of your house. And basically the difference between those two sets your premium. And that's why, as you talked about earlier, home elevations become really important in places where the flood insurance program is having an impact. If you can elevate your home really high, you can elevate above where a projected flood would come to and make your flood insurance premiums really, really marginal, basically.
What's interesting is part of my studies, I also was looking at Arvern by the Sea and Coney Island. So Arvern by the Sea is a renamed area of the Rockaways. Under Giuliani, the Rockaways were rezoned to encourage and incentivize development. And right now you have this sort of like comically, rich area on the water with all these new flood resilient, quote unquote, developments that are advertising themselves under this sort of rubric of resiliency. And literally there's a train track that divides that sort of luxury condo town from NYCHA housing with some of the worst, some of the worst conditions, and especially environmentally, in the city. And so that sort of uneven development is really, really in your face over in the Rockaways. And what's interesting is that in Coney Island, a new development went up on the water in a flood zone that the city itself designated as like one of the worst areas to build, and no one should be building there. And yet they let a giant glass tower go up. I believe this one was financed by John Catsimatidis.
Mm-hmm.
And so when let me ask you something. When these buildings go up, the flood insurance being paid by the developer, and those costs are being passed on to potential renters. Like, well, I imagine that who pays flood insurance is different depending on the type of housing that gets built.
Yeah. So normally with a large development like that, the developers will actually be buying private flood insurance because they can basically get a better deal that way. So the National Flood Insurance Program tends to be much more sort of like ordinary homeowners. And then for a large developer like that, they'll be going to the private flood insurance market, which is a lot more tailored towards developers and commercial actors, although it is expanding to try and grab more of a residential presence. But yeah, so what you see in those cases is that, yeah, the insurance costs are basically being passed on to the renters or the owners or whoever. And so that's why insurance costs are just like so important to think about in any coastal environment, because you know that those costs are being passed down to whoever is living there. And also at the same time, that makes important different forms of resilient infrastructure being built, or resilient sort of housing structures being built, because those can reduce the insurance costs and sort of reduce the value and affordability in the long term.
So I think to sort of guide us towards our conclusion here, I want us to think about the future of development and housing and tenants' rights specifically around the resiliency discourse, and what we're going to do in this era where climate change is hitting everywhere, and we can expect New York City to be underwater. So, like, how are we supposed to wrestle with this contradiction of knowing that we need to protect people from rising sea levels, and at the same time, ensuring that they're able to live a dignified life and like find work? There seems to be, as all of this work points out to, this like glaring sort of problem, and to me the answer needs to be rooted within, among other things, tenants' rights, and sort of making sure that rent control, and making sure landlords have as little power as possible, is guided through this whole thing. So how are you thinking about these sort of development questions along the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think one thing that I really think about a lot is like this sort of Lefebvrean idea of the right to the city, right? And sort of like, what is it that makes these coastal areas special, or what is it that makes them the places that they are? And that in most cases, that those are like the people who not just live, but who work there, who reproduce these places through their labor and through their leisure, right? And so to really think about these coastal places as, if we want to quote unquote save them, if we want to make them resilient, does that mean are they saved, or are they resilient if everybody who lives there right now has to move out and there's a new sort of population of wealthy second, third vacation home owners who spend a few weeks a year in the place? Or is having vibrant working class communities by the coast something that's valuable to us? Do the people who work at these entertainment complexes that people frequent by the coast? Do we think it's valuable for them to have a place to live by these places that their labor makes possible? Or are we okay with them, living 50 miles inland and having to commute 2 hours every day, right? So these are questions that we have to explore, right? Who has the right to the city? Who has the right to these coastal areas? I also think that, when I think about all of these challenges that we face, really, I just think none of this would be that daunting, frankly, in a world with planning, in a world with comprehensive urban planning that was multi-scalar, that was not just urban, but it was regional, it was statewide, and it was nationwide. And those were all nested in each other, that we had these coherent plans that we were executing outside of just the realm of private capital. We could accomplish so much in terms of really looking at coastal areas and being thoughtful about where are the places that people just shouldn't live. In a world with planning, with comprehensive planning, and with social housing and tenants' rights, you could have really serious conversations about, hey, maybe nobody should live in this specific area. Maybe this land strip should just be depopulated, and it should be returned to being a barrier island that protects the flood resilience of everyone inland. In a world with planning, you can have that conversation. You could say, hey, costs and benefits of us getting out of here, maybe we can reconstitute this community somewhere else. In a world without planning, saying, hey, maybe people just shouldn't live here is an invitation for market forces to slowly and quietly push people out over the course of decades and be redistributed God knows where across the country. So that's always what I come back to is planning, planning, planning. In a world with planning, in a world where we embrace comprehensive planning, these challenges ahead of us could be scalable and they could actually be exciting. We could be the crisis actors, right? We could be the ones who are saying, wow, this is actually a fantastic opportunity. In a world without that sort of comprehensive planning, or where the private sector drives all the planning that we do, it's difficult to be optimistic about the future of these coastal areas, at least as places that are vibrant and lively and have a place for people who aren't just unbelievably wealthy.
Yeah, there's that, large conversation about, what is the future of, migration towards, more, I guess to use this word again, resilient areas like Michigan, like Buffalo, like Pittsburgh, sort of near fresh water, not, they're not going to flood. Mm-hmm. They're sort of fireproof. There's already, industrial infrastructure, those sort of uneven geographies of environmental gentrification. Should there be the sort of population shift away from the coasts and towards, the Midwest, the northern area of the Midwest? I mean, we're looking at environmental gentrification where we wouldn't see it necessarily. We wouldn't think about these things. But, these questions are going to be with us for a long time, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back to keep going.
Absolutely. I would love that.
Zach, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, my friends, I think that's going to do it for Housing Trap today. I want to thank Zach Paganini and Andrew Schustek for putting together this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you want to check out more Housing Trap stuff, more Nostalgia Trap stuff, check out our Patreon page. The link is in the episode description. I hope you're doing well. Let's talk again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.